Hello, everyone. I am Catherine Bourne, a hospice volunteer who has seen over 10 patients over the past 4 years and has spent over 300 hours interacting with patients in the administrative side of hospice. Hospice is an end of life palliative care for people who have a 6-month prognosis. Now, what does that mean? It means that individuals who have an illness that is terminal and their physician believes without treatment for it they will die in 6 months, you are eligible for hospice. To then enter hospice, patients must end the treatment for the terminal disease. What this does not mean is that care stops for the patient. The care simply shifts from trying to find a cure to trying to provide comfort. For example, if a patient has a terminal cancer diagnosis, they will still receive their blood pressure medication. They will still get treatment for the flu if they develop it after entering hospice, or before it. The care's main focus becomes preserving quality of life and making sure that the patient can live as peacefully as possible. Within hospice, a care team is composed of nurses, doctors, social workers, chaplains, grief counselors, and volunteers. Some hospices have different ratios of these workers or slight changing of roles or adding in new members, but this is the basic format. Each member of the team has scheduled times, with volunteers being a more flexible schedule, to meet with the patient. The nurses provide around-the-clock care, with hotlines for families or facilities to call to have hospice nurses overnight come to provide care. The doctors help provide more specialized care, either at the location of the patient or, in more rare cases of needing to go to the hospital, their doctors are already informed. Chaplains and social workers aim to preserve the mental health and help connect families to services that would aid their families. For example, the social worker, when aware that the patient is a veteran, can help connect them to resources either outside the VA or a few that they know of in the community. Grief counselors have the role of helping the patient accept their death, while most hospices also allow the grief counselors to help the families, generally up to a year after the death of the patient, to help come to terms with this difficult decision and eventual passing. Volunteers are unique as their role is to make a connection with the patient, even though both know it will not be long term. For many, this is freeing and allowing them to see someone who isn't grieving over their loved one or friend dying, or a medical professional who has to go through vital checking. It gives the patient time to be listened to and treated as normal in some ways. Importantly, chaplains, grief counselors, and volunteers are available for a patient but not forced upon them if they decline it. Hospices aim to provide their services anywhere they can. It can be provided at a hospital, in a facility, or at the comfort of one's own home. And with a facility, the facility can be one of the hospice's own or one of the family's choosing. These services come to a patient whenever possible, leaving where hospice can be provided a very open and broad category. I have volunteered with patients in their homes or at facilities, with my experience with facilities a bit more common, because I get awkward in someone's home. Before I go talking about any of the patient stories I have, it is important for me to note the difference between, as a volunteer, volunteering at someone's home or in a facility. In someone's home, it's really intimate in some ways. Most of the time, it will be yourself as a volunteer, the patient, and possibly their caregiver, but not always. And this leads to a really intimate feeling, really small and personal, that as someone who's awkward, I'm not always up for that challenge. In comparison, there are facilities. With my hospice not doing hospital volunteering ever, really. But at a facility, there is more people can hear you, there's more things going on. It can be a little exposing in that aspect of, especially depending on where you're volunteering with this patient. For example, if they're out in the main room and we're talking, people can walk by and hear it, and that's occasionally slightly uncomfortable, but I'm able to get past it a lot more. And if they need help with something, it's easier for me to be able to poke my head out into the hall or, flag down one of the nurses instead of trying to flag down the caregiver or contacting them. And for me, this is just a personal preference. It varies greatly by volunteer. This is important for N, the story of who I'm going to be calling N. She was my first patient who was in a facility. I had one patient before her who was in a home, and so this was a very new experience, something that I didn't know how comfortable I was going to be. However, from the moment I met her, she was very happy. Her mental faculties were declining, but that didn't stop her from seeing the world and being happy and wanting to have a friendship and connection. And that connection, I greatly reciprocated. I became a friend to this person. And not only like the bond on their end, but for them, they were a friend. It was someone who I could talk to, I enjoyed and had an excitement to go meet. And uniquely with N, instead of it being volunteering with her for about 6 months, she lasted a full year with me as her volunteer. So I had time to develop this really long relationship that was about double what was expected. And it was very fulfilling. Someone who I could go to and I could talk with and be treated entirely with, regardless of how awkward I felt or my own difficulties with making social connections, it did not matter to her. And that was a really freeing thing for me. One of the big things I did for her at the end of her care was reading to her. She had loved reading, but her eyesight had gone enough that she just couldn't read anymore. And it all started with her asking me to read an obituary of a friend that was mailed to her. And I read it to her, and she then, was commenting on how sad she is that she can no longer read. So together, for the next, I think, maybe 10 visits, each week I'd read a chapter of Where the Red Fern Grows. And towards the end of that book, she started heavily declining. Her death was a very drawn-out affair of over a month. And for parts of it, it was very challenging for me. She was someone who I had volunteered with for so long. It had such a strong emotional connection with her. But at the end of the day, I knew she needed it. I was not going to let her be alone towards the end. And so the final visit with her was, I don't even know how aware she was, but regardless, I knew I had to sit by her, hold her hand, and let her know that she's not alone. The next story is of someone who I'll call E, who, unlike N, went really quickly. I had in total been volunteering with him for about 2 months before he passed, but he's someone who I was his volunteer because he needed a challenge. He was someone with Parkinson's who was a former college professor who, while his body was giving up, basically, his mind was still there. He still had that drive of intellect, wanting to talk about complex topics that no one else around him really could. And so I was picked as his volunteer because I was an anatomy major, because I was looking at graduate school, because I was looking at an academic career, and he needed someone to come be an academic with him. He was really prideful, and so each time when we got there, I had apparently made a great first impression on him by, in the first visit, talking about, bouncing between biochemistry and the fall of the Roman Empire, as was my current classes. But each time I came there, we talked ecology, we talked biochemistry, we talked about neurogenetics, we talked about anatomy, and I provided a lot of mental stimulation, essentially. There was one day where we had an argument. Well, not a full argument, that's a bit of a stretch, but more of a disagreement over we didn't understand what each other were talking about until I realized that that concept had been renamed in the 60s. So we were talking about the same thing, but we had different names for it because of the like when we learned it. And that was a moment where where he basically said, "Wow, I'm really old." But each time I came there, it was this intellectual back and forth. And he never asked anything about me, pretty much, until my last visit. He saw me wearing my classic University of Nebraska Omaha hoodie and asked, "Are you from, like, where is that from?" And I said, "Nebraska." And he's like, "Oh, are you from there?" And I'm like, "Yep." And then we got right back to talking about science. And his death was a very sudden thing. No one really expected it, but it was one of those moments where he was, while he never explicitly said it, he was scared of a slow decline. And so in the end, I think that's truly what was best for him, and something that I'm glad I could make the time before that a little less full of despair. The last story is of someone who I did not volunteer with. It's the story of my grandfather. By the time my grandfather needed to be put into hospice care, I had already been a volunteer for approximately 2 years at Bristol Hospice. And as he was supposed to go into hospice, my father was against it completely. He thought that if someone goes into hospice, you're just sending them off to die. That it would be dragging them off to a facility, that it would be something terrible. And I looked him in the eye and I said, "Dad, do you trust me? Do you trust in what I've done and trust that I know and care about my grandfather enough to protect him? That I don't want him to be in pain?" And from that conversation, my grandfather was put into hospice. He remained at our home, with my mother being the primary caretaker of him. And what hospice provided for him was pain management. That he could, without having to go to the hospital for being in agony, he could be at home. He could be with us, me every Saturday coming to have my dinner, like family dinner with him, bringing my fiance to play card games with him, that at the end of the day, he was able to die in his favorite chair at home, where he had, throughout my memory of him, always been. That was very hard, pivoting from a hospice volunteer to the family member of one. And that experience really reaffirmed how powerful hospice can be and how important it is that there's support, that there are people, that people aren't alone and isolated, that they still feel loved. And if you take away nothing else from this video, I hope that you know that hospice care can be something beautiful and something necessary and something that, even though it's a really dark time of someone's life, that there's a few bright stars to break it up, that darkness. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.